And these are the laws that you must place before them. So Rashi, first Rashi, V'eile hamishpotim, v'eile devav, kol mokshinem eile, posel Rishonim. If we should say these are the laws, what's the inference of these? These means it's to exclude anything else other than these. But there and these, it's adding to what was said previously. Ve'ele Mosef al Rishonim, Ma Rishonim Sinai. Just as in Yisrael, we spoke about laws. The Aser Sadibros were Sinai. Af Ele Sinai. These laws which are presented here will also be Sinai. Okay. Firstly, why would we consider them not be Sinai? These laws. I always mention, we find that Pirkei Avos begins with the transmission of Torah. From its origin, Moshe Kibbel Torah Sinai, Misar Yeshua, Yushal Kanim. Now, Rabbi Yehuda Nossi is the redactor of the oral law. He's the author of the Mishnah. Pirkei Avos is in which section of Shas? It's in Nezikin. Nezikin is the middle order of Shas. The 6 orders, 6 parts, it's the middle order. So you would think, if Rabbi Yehuda Nossi is giving us the origin of Torah, where should he introduce the origin? When he begins Shas, Brachos. Before we start, B'Seches Brachos, Moshe Kibbel Torah Sinai, Misar Yeshua, we speak of the laws of Kriya Shema, according to the Rambam, the laws of Tefillah, which are Doraisa. And we continue speaking about the origin. Whatever we speak now is based on what was transmitted at Sinai. But where does Rabbi Yehuda Nossi give us the background? Pirkei Avos. They all ask this question. So the answer that's given is, the average person who learns Pirkei Avos, and you read its ethics, morals, values, the average person says, El Chachamim, Hillel, Shammai, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, whoever the individuals are, the personalities, these people surpassed and were more advanced than any psychiatrist, psychologist, sociologist, everything. Our rabbis were geniuses. They had such profound understandings of the psyche of a person and what proper and refined behavior is. Rabbi Yehuda Nossi says, don't make that mistake. Just as Tefillin on Sinai, which is understood, and Shabbos is Sinai, which is understood, the moral and ethic code of the Jew is no less from Sinai. Because here maybe you can mistakenly think it's not rooted in Sinai. So he says, no. Moshe Kibbel Torah Sinai, and then that's the introduction to Pirkei Avos. That's where Yehuda Nossi had to say it specifically there. It was an oversight, and he caught himself, says, I overlooked it. I didn't give you the background. It's specifically here. So you would say, maybe these laws, they're equitable, they're rational. Eila Mishpotim. These are the laws. They're not Sinai laws. We say, the Gemara tells us in many locations, Lomeli Kros Svarahu. Very often the Torah establishes a halacha based on a pasuk. Versus what do you mean the pasuk? It's logic. If God endowed man with intelligence and it's logical, why is it necessary for the Torah to write it? It's like the Gemara says, if it's a kal v'chomer, what do we need a pasuk? We just had in Daf Yomi. Torah v'kosav l'kro. Even with sometimes things that could be extrapolated from kal v'chomer, the Torah goes out of its way to write a pasuk. Torah kosav l'kro. So that's a question. But if you could interpret the pasuk differently, we don't say that. But something which is openly and simply logical, Torah would not write a pasuk. So maybe you'd say these laws are understood. They're rational laws. If you want to establish a society and you don't want to have a penal system, we speak about a person steals rather than putting him in prison and he becomes corrupted. And whatever it is, he's a debtor. How does he pay his debt? He becomes a Hebrew slave. These are the laws. 6 years is not overdoing it. If he is able to pay off the debt in 6 years, yes. If not, not. And all the laws of damages. Otherwise, you can't have a society. So the Torah says, don't make a mistake. Ve'ela mishpatim. That as rational as these laws may be, and as great as Al Chachamim are, as great as Moshe Rabbeinu was, these are all divine laws. Just as Aseres Adibros are irrefutably the word of Hashem, because we heard it directly from Hashem, identically these laws, which you may attribute, we had great judicial people, great people who could actually, like Yisro, introduce the concept of the judicial system. That was Yisro. Maybe over here the laws are also, they're human laws, not divine. Don't make that mistake. Ve'ela mishpotim, that just as the original laws were from Sinai, these laws already also Sinai laws. These are divine laws. Because you may think differently, okay? Then it continues. And why specifically the laws of the court, the judicial system, that the Sanhedrin should be by the Mikdash. Now, we studied Sanhedrin at one time. The three types of courts. There's a court of 3 judges, there's a court of 23 judges, and there's a court of 71 judges. The court of 71 judges was known as the Sanhedrin Hagdolah, the Great Sanhedrin. Every community that had minimally 120 people was required to have a court of 23 judges. Every one of these judges were ordained by Moshe Rabbeinu. And then you have a court of 3. A court of 3 judges is able to rule on monetary, even to give lashes, but for death penalty, anything that carries the death penalty, you need minimally a court of 23 judges. If the court does not have 23 judges, they cannot rule on capital cases. You have to have 23. However, there's something very interesting. The only time the lower court of 23 is able to rule on capital punishment, this is only if the high court was convening on the Temple Mount. There was a chamber, which was called Lishkas HaGozis, the chamber of cut stone, which was on the Temple Mount. It was literally adjacent to the sanctuary where the Mizbeach was. There was a chamber of cut stone. Right out the door was the sanctuary where the Mizbeach was. So if they convened there, then every court throughout Eretz Yisrael, the lower courts, they could rule on capital cases. If the high court was not in session, the lower court cannot rule on it, on capital crimes. Now the question is why? What's the reason? Why did they have to be specifically in that location? Not only for themselves, but even for the lower courts. Now, 2 things. So what I used to say, the reason why they had to be, firstly, why did they have to convene on the Temple Mount adjacent to the Shekhinah, to the divine presence? Now, to be qualified to be on the High Court of Israel, what had to be the level of proficiency of Torah for that individual? It's a level that we can't even relate to. Firstly, in Torah, but in addition to Torah, they had to be expert and proficient in every law of idolatry. Why? Because if a person was an idolater, whatever the idolatry was, they had to be able to evaluate the case to find the person innocent or guilty. But if they're not aware of that type of idolatry, how could they make that evaluation? So they had to be well versed in every type of idolatry. What about sorcery? We read in this week's parsha that a sorcerer, a mechashef or mechashefa, depends a male or female, if they engage in witchcraft, it's punishable by death. We're talking about not sleight of hand. What is truly sorcery, what they had in Egypt, it's punishable by death. Now, how does the judge know exactly what sorcery is and what sorcery is not? So they had to be fully well-versed and adept in sorcery to be able to make an evaluation, whether it is or not, to find the person innocent or guilty. They had to be, as we had, the court has to hear the testimony directly from the witnesses. The only evidence which is considered hardcore evidence is testimony. That means the witnesses who testify, the court has to hear it directly from the witnesses. They can't hear it through an interpreter. So let's say the witness came from wherever it may be in the world, and he speaks a language which most people don't understand. It's a problem. You can't have an interpreter. The judges themselves who convene, they have to understand the 70 languages. Everyone, whatever the language may be, The judges themselves have to understand the language. That's the story with Mordechai, with Big Son Viserys. When they were plotting to poison the king, they spoke a language. They didn't believe anybody would understand that language. But they were within the earshot of Mordechai, who was a member of the Sanhedrin, because he understood 70 languages. He understood how they were plotting, although it was in another language, a foreign language. So what level of genius these people what they have to be? It's something. It's not to be realized or to relate to this level of genius they were. A person with that level of genius, very often it's almost impossible to have the humility that's required to see things clearly. So by having them convene on the Temple Mount, where you sense God's presence, that will put them straight. As we say every morning, Kol Chachamim Kavli Mado, Unvom Kli Haskel. When you stand in the presence of God, the greatest genius is like he has no intelligence. The most insightful person has no brains. We say it every morning in right after Birchas HaShachar. So when they're there and they convene there, they have a sense of Hashem's presence. By being humble, therefore, they have relevance to see things correctly. That's the way I always understood. That's the reason why the Sanhedrin Gedolah, they are the high court, the most advanced Torah sages on every level. That's why they have to convene there. Okay? But the question is, even that may be true, but it's only if they're in session, then the lower courts of 23 can rule on capital cases. But if they're not in session, although the others are qualified, they can't. Why is one depend on? They themselves, we understand, they have to be there for them to rule because they need that level of humility. But the other courts are not in the presence of the Shekhinah, of the divine presence. And they can only rule if the high court is in location and in session on the Temple Mount in the presence of Shekhinah. The question is why? Because my first explanation doesn't answer that. Now, every day when we finish the Amidah and we step out of Shemon Esrei, we have a bakosha, we have a supplication. Okay? We ask Hashem, the will of God should be, the Beis Hamikdash should be built speedily in our time. And what follows? And give us our portion in your Torah. That's what we ask every morning. What is the binyan Beis Hamikdash? What is the building of the temple speedily have to, and we should receive our portion, our rightful portion of the Torah. Seichel Kenu. As the Chofetz Chaim says, that at Sinai, each Jew received his particular portion. And we have the merit to receive that portion. So when the Beis Hamikdash will be rebuilt, then we're going to receive our portion of Torah. Why? The answer is because if you're that connected to the Shekhinah, to the divine presence, then you merit to receive your portion of Torah. Only then do you receive it. For a judge to rule a verdict which is emes labito shel Torah, to come upon truth, which is absolute truth, that you're not subject to human oversight, you need a special divine intervention. To have that divine intervention, you have to be on the Temple Mount. You have to be connected to the Shekhinah. So all the other courts, the lower courts, they only merit that siyata d'shmaya, that divine intervention, when the high court is on the Temple Mount. When they're on the Temple Mount, connected to the Shekhinah, everything funnels down to every other court. So, but if they're not in session there, you don't have that connection. If you don't have that connection, it's questionable whether you have that level of clarity to give a verdict which is a truthful verdict. So therefore, regarding taking a life, for that, to rule on capital punishment, they can't rule. But if the high court is in session on the Temple Mount, where it's connected to the Shekhinah, every lower court merits the siyata d'shmaya, the divine intervention, to have that level of clarity to rule even on a capital case. That's the way I understood it.